I'm Mark Baxa, President and CEO of the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, and I am excited to join today with all of you for what you wish your CEO knew about truckload and LTL freight. Co-sponsored and presented by TranzAct Technologies and Mike Reagan, leader of that organization. Mike, we're so glad that you partnered with CSCMP and more specifically, our Center of Excellence for Transportation. Inside of CSCMP, we're working on methods to create greater member value, starting with centers of excellence focused on transportation. There'll be others like this in the very near future. The center, as a part of CSCMP, focuses on methodologies, government relations, and government impact, the latest and greatest in innovative practices, and like we all need today, solutions for navigating the road ahead in 2023. We live in a very dynamic market, and information is needed, really time and place that's very valuable for practitioners who are leading transportation practices and other practices in the supply chain. We began with transportation as our center of excellence because of our longstanding relationship and ownership of NASTRAC, a great organization that stood the test of time, that became part of CSCMP, which is now embedded inside of the heart of the Transportation Center of Excellence. Today's program, brought to you by TranzAct and co-branded with CSCMP, is just one of the many examples that we provide for our members and guests around the world to hear some of the greatest content in transportation. We're joined today by Dr. Chris Kaplis, Executive Director of MIT's Center for Transportation and Logistics, and Kevin Smith, former Senior Vice President of Supply Chain for CVS Caremark, former Chairman of the Board of the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, and ongoing board member at the executive level. Mike, I'll turn it back to you, and I know that I'm just as excited as anyone to hear today's presentation. Great lineup, great content.
Well, Mark, thank you very much. And coming out of the chutes with the Center of Excellence, I am delighted and thrilled to be bringing this presentation. Let me just try and set it up for you. I've known Chris for a long time. We've both been honored by CSCMP with the Distinguished Service Award, and had the opportunity to interview Chris on various things that are going on at the truckload market. Chris, in February of 2021, we did a thing about changes in the sourcing area, and he is one of the more astute observers of what's happening in the industry and the response that should elicit from shippers that are charged with managing supply chains and logistics and transportation areas. And I'm also delighted to have Kevin Smith join us. Kevin and I have also known each other a long time. I guess that's what happens, guys, as you mature. you get to know each other. But Kevin has been the leader of CSCMP and at CVS. And one of the things that I've asked Chris and Kevin to do is to address what I think is a very important topic, and that is to clear up the mystery about one of the real challenges that I think transportation and logistics and supply chain people have, and that is helping their C-level executives understand why sourcing transportation services and capabilities is different than procurement processes in place for traditional commodities. So many of you on this call, whether it's steel, foodstuffs, plastics, you name it, there is a cadence associated with those procurement events. And that cadence in the transportation area can be significantly different. And that brings me to today's presentation. I had the opportunity to sit in on Chris's presentation that he did at CSCMP's annual conference. I walked out of there and I said, that was one of the best presentations I have ever heard that will help supply chain and logistics and transportational professionals understand the key variables that they must be able to address with their C-level executives if they want them to do the things that have to be done to become, quote unquote, that shipper of choice that everyone wants to aspire to. I want to also set the table for you, and then I'll turn it over to Chris, and then Chris and Kevin will interact, and Kevin will have some thoughts about sharing information with the C-level suite executives about things they need to be aware of. But one of the things that really surprised me when we were on the trade show floor after the presentation, I had several people come up that heard the presentation, Chris, and they said, you know, the reality of it is everybody in this business, the supply chain and logistics, whether you're on the carrier side or the shipper side, needs to hear this message. And I want to emphasize a key point. This is not about getting lower rates per se. So for those of you that dialed in saying, okay, I'm going to listen to this webcast and I'm going to be armed with the tools that I need to get the lower rates that are being demanded by our, executives within the organization, that could possibly occur. But the real purpose of this webcast is to make sure that everybody understands what we're dealing with when we go to procure transportation services. And Chris's presentation at CSCMP dealt primarily with truckload, but one of the things that we also discussed was that the key principles here, whether it's truckload, LTL, parcel, or even for that matter, ocean, air, rail, et cetera, intermodal, these principles are timeless and expand across the entire transportation rainbow. So we're looking forward to having Chris and Kevin share their thoughts. Just one housekeeping note here. If you have questions, please type them in the Q&A session, and we will do our best. We had some folks send in questions ahead of time. So when we go to the Q&A part, I'll have some of those questions. But if you have things that you would like to see specifically addressed, please type them in the Q&A. So with that thought in mind, it's my pleasure and honor to turn it over to Dr. Chris Caplist for what your CEO, what you wish your CEO knew about truckload and LTL freight. Chris, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate it. Let me make sure. Can everyone see my screen now?
Yes. Yep.
We good? All right. So let me just move some things around. All right. So thanks. I really appreciate this. A great chance to talk with, have a conversation with you as well, Kevin. Haven't talked for a little while, so this will be a lot of fun. As Mike said, this is a presentation I made at CSCMP last month. Great conference. It's so great to be out with people instead of doing everything on Zoom. Zoom's awesome sometimes, but it's so nice to be and have an audience. And so what my talk was specifically on, to Mike's point, was what the C-suite, because the CEO is one thing, but the CFO is a whole nother thing. And if you have a chief procurement officer, they have the same thing. So this is anyone at that C level, because as we've discussed earlier, the whole C-suite needs to be engaged with this. And it was mainly focused on truckload, but I'm going to rely on Kevin to expand some of that out and talk about some other aspects as they apply to LTL as well. The reason why I gave this talk, and is mainly because my membership, or as my role as chief scientist at DAT Freight and Analytics, was that we get questioned a lot. And so we had a slot to make a presentation. I said, what should I talk about? And I should talk about what people have been asking me for the last several months. And this came in two main roles. Let me explain where my background is, just so you see where I'm coming from for this talk. And I have two hats. One is at MIT, and this is where I'm the executive director of the Center for Transportation and Logistics. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary next year, have a bunch of events coming up. I will, hopefully you'll be able to participate in those. But what we do at CTL is we work with companies to drive innovation in supply chain management into practice. So a lot of the conversations I had leading to this presentation came from my engagement with companies that are working with us up at CTL, along with my freight lab that I created with Dave Carell, another researcher up here at MIT. But in addition to what I do at MIT, I'm also the chief scientist at DAT Freight and Analytics. DAT is a company that every shipper and broker, or every carrier and broker, has known for decades, and shippers are now only just recognizing them. They are the largest market in truckload transportation in North America. They have over 150,000 customers. And so my conversations with these companies also helped bring out some of the questions that I'm going to talk about. So the real driver here was that the common comment that I heard from the roundtables that I run. We run a monthly shipper roundtable for DAT. Many of you members are on this call. I saw. It's good to see some of you here. They ask the same question in many different forms. They say, I wish my C-suite knew X about truckload transportation in general. And this X might be, I wish my C-suite knew that just because spot rates went down by 30% doesn't mean contract rates will go down by 30%. I wish my C-suite knew that if just because I have a contract for a lane doesn't mean I'm going to get a truck every time I need one. So these are the kind of intricacies about truckload and LTL transportation that us transportation and supply chain executives kind of know. We have it in our blood, but above us, it's a little foreign to them. And that's because truckload in particular is different. It's not like the other commodities, and it's different in many different ways. And I'll talk about that in a second, but I tried to think of a parallel, and what kind of parallel could I think about? And since this is where I went to school and where I met my wife, I thought about Austin. Because Austin has, this is their slogan, right? Austin is weird. Keep Austin weird. It's a great city. And I thought about truckload. Truckload's the same thing. And so I want to have t-shirts made up, keep truckload weird, because it is weird. And your job is to let the CEOs know why it's weird. And because it's weird, how you should do something differently. Because like I said, it's not like the other commodities. And let me explain why that is in a couple slides. First is you can think of it as that it's big. And let me explain what I mean when I talk about truckload transportation. Typically what we do up at MIT, we try to explain transportation in a bunch of different ways. And one is we explain technological modes versus economic modes. Technological modes is the way we always think about it. It's a combination of infrastructure or vehicle and control type. For example, you've got trucks, they operate on roads, tractors pull trailers, and it's public guideways. Railroads go on rails with engines, and it's private for the most part. So you have these technological modes, and that's how it's reported. So in the bottom left here, I'm showing CSCMP's and Kearney's recent report of the size of the market. And you can see that trucking, these are all modes that are the technological modes. And it's saying that, 69% of all logistics spend was in trucking, of transportation spend in 2021. But if you break this up, what's more important is breaking the components of trucking into the big divisions, and that's full truckload versus LTL, and also versus dedicated. They keep those separate. And so by looking at this, you can see that full truckload is a huge chunk, 40% of that trucking. So it's a massive market. LTL's smaller, and we'll talk more about that. And then you see private and dedicated. And so what I want to point out here for truckload, it's a big market. 300 billion is a big market. So that's one thing about it. It's a large market, and what that typically means, and we'll talk more about, there are many different players. But I want to point out one thing, this $415 billion for private and dedicated, just as a point, dedicated went up over 39% 2020 to 2021. And that was because shippers were responding to that surge in the demand and the lack of capacity. So we'll see, it'll be interesting to see how that changes over time, but I just wanted to point that out. But so you see the difference in full truckload and less than truckload in terms of size, but they differ dramatically in another way. So this is how most people report transportation, by technological mode. But up at MIT, we like to talk about economic mode, because every technological mode can be handled in two different ways, consolidated or direct. So consolidated is where you have a single origin, single destination. A vehicle picks up, makes its delivery, drops off, and then has to reposition, has to find another load. Compare this to a consolidated or scheduled, where you have a pickup cycle that's going on a route, going on a set schedule, line hauls terminal to terminal, right? And so it's very set and structured, scheduled runs, and you're consolidating little things into big things for the line haul. So the way I like to think about it up at MIT is there's only two modes, economic modes of transportation: buses and taxis. That's it. And so you can think of LTL is a bus and truckload is a taxi. And you can think about this for all the other modes. Unit trains tend to be taxis. Regular rail move tends to be buses. So you can go through all the technical modes and carve this out, but we're just talking about trucking right now. And let me explain why this matters. It's not just an interesting classification. They're treated very differently because they have very different economics. Taxis are driven by economies of scope. In other words, where I go to will drive my cost, because I have to find a follow-on load. So it's not just giving more volume, it's where that volume is on the lanes. Scope matters because you have empty miles. Buses, on the other hand, are all about scale, right? You want scale. The more you have, then the lower your unit costs are going to be. So buses and taxis have very different economics. This also drives the level barrier of entry. You have a low barrier of entry to be a taxi, to be an individual driver point to point. And so what that means is going to lead to many more players. And that's my third point. It's a big market in terms of dollars. Truckload tends to be driven by economies of scope, not scale. And there are a lot of players. So let's talk about the three major players within truckload transportation and LTL transportation. You got shippers, right? You got over 1 million of you guys out there doing stuff, and you're buying transportation. Some of you provide your own transportation. But for carriers, there's over 200,000 truckload carriers. The exact number fluctuates. It's really hard to get a fixed number on this. You recognize some of the big ones, Schneider, Hunt, Knight Swift. But then you've got the organization OIDA, the Owner Operator Independent Driver Association. And that's actually represents more drivers than all the other companies combined, right? So if you look at this fleet size, and this is from the Freight Motor Carrier Safety Administration, FMCSA, SCA. So what we look at is fleet size. And let me just point this out. Every row is the size of the fleet for a company. So this one means it's an owner operator. Down here means they have over 5,000 trucks, the number of firms, the number of tractors within that, and then as a percentage of total. And as you look at this, 96% of truckload carriers have less than 20 trucks, 96%. But flipping it around, just 4%, that's the 21 and higher, these ones represent 64% of the total capacity. So you have some big players, but you have a massive long tail, and it's not going away. And so what does that mean? That means you have almost a perfectly competitive market. And so no one, no buyer or no seller makes the market. This is different from other modes, right? And so whether you're the biggest buyer out there with a Walmart or someone else, you're not going to set the market. You're going to pull from the market. Everyone is a price taker. And because there's such a long tail, this introduces a third player in here, which is brokers. And these have grown. 3PLs, call themselves 4PLs, whatever you want to say. Intermediaries are growing in importance over the last 15, 20 years. And they're there mainly because they're taking care of this long tail. And they fit into the whole portfolio, which we'll talk about in a second. And by my latest count, there's about 17,000 of these, because the barrier to entry to being a trucking company is very low. You need a truck, a CDL, and probably a phone to access the market and load boards. But to be a broker, you pretty much need a phone. So there's a lot of those out there as well. And so these are the players. And this is kind of why truckload, one reason why truckload's a little different. It's big money, many, many, many players, many of them very small. You have different intermediaries. And so there you have perfect competition. So the question is, what do shippers do? And so shippers tend to have been using this methodology for the last 30 years. Since deregulation in the 80s, it took about a decade to work things out. Since the 90s forward, there's been this two-stage process. First stage is an annual RFP, request for proposal. It's a reverse auction where carriers are awarded the rights to haul freight on a lane over a period of time, usually a year because it's run annually, sometimes 2 years, sometimes shorter. And then at the end of the day, the results of that go into something called the routing guide in the TMS, in the transportation management system. And then when a load hits a real shipment, it gets tendered to the primary carrier on that lane, gets matched up. They accept it every time, right? And then we're done. And this is how it's supposed to work. But it's a two-stage process. One, you do strategically setting up the plan. And the second stage is execution of the plan. And that's typically done for contract in the routing guide. And so that's how it's typically done. And so let me spend a second talking about the annual RFP, because there's been a lot of discussions about, is the annual RFP dead? And you know, what's going on there. And so let me talk about what's going on. And because I'm affiliated with MIT, I'm by law required to show an equation. Let me explain what's going on underneath when they do the RFPs, because everyone out there, every system out there worth its salt has a mixed integer linear program hiding beneath the nice, cute user interface. And so what it's doing, it's allowing you to solve for lowest cost assignment subject to certain constraints. So let me explain what's going on here. Every linear program, mixed integer linear program, has what's known as an objective function, which is this thing I'm circling that you're trying to either minimize or maximize. In this case, we're trying to minimize cost. And it's subject to a bunch of constraints. And these constraints are things such as every lane has at least, one carrier assigned to it. I have no more than X carriers. I make sure that minority carriers get at least X or Y amount of the business. All these kind of business constraints that you want. And then the third element is you have the decision variable. And the decision variable is what you're trying to decide. And it's this carrier gets this much volume on this lane for the next year. So this is what this mathematical program is doing. And when this was first introduced in the 90s, it was revolutionary because it allowed shippers to go beyond just ranking them carriers by price and just kind of picking them one by one. It lets you take a holistic view. So it allowed you to include constraints where I want to make sure that, say, my local carriers get a certain amount of business. I want to make sure I have no more than 10 carriers servicing a DC, all these kind of business constraints that you can imply. But one of the real reasons that it was put out there, and this is what my dissertation was on, I published papers on this and many other people have, is because we thought we solved the economies of scope problem. If I run a straight auction lane by lane, then if a carrier is looking for 2 lanes they want to bundle together, because remember they have the economies of scope where going from A to B, the cost is a function of what I have coming from B. Well, we thought, well, let's let them bid in packages. Let them do these kind of package bids or complex bids and assign them. Therefore, we've solved the economies of scope problem, and then they can lower their rates because they achieve lower costs and the shipper gets a lower price. It failed miserably, never worked, only works in theoretical papers. And it didn't work because what we ignored, what I missed, was that second stage. This would work perfectly if nothing changed, and that what came out of the RFP would be perfect. And unfortunately, stuff happens, right? And so what happened here is that carriers stopped submitting them because shippers stopped awarding them. Even if they were awarded, they never really got the business. So package bids sound good theoretically. I mean, they were kind of interesting, didn't really pan out. But the optimization that was put in place to enable those has been a real game changer and has been really helpful because it allows you to not just add constraints, but you can add other softer things. Like I want to favor incumbents, for example, because no one likes churn, favor them by 5%, 7%, whatever. I can disfavor certain carriers by a certain amount. And that can be done within the model and let you tweak. And so you can make trade-offs for non-financial considerations along with the financial costs. So using this optimization has been very powerful and it's transformed procurement, especially in transportation. But it was originally put in for something that was an abject failure, which is package bids, which is kind of interesting and kind of depressing as an academic, but it is what it is. So
Chris, can I interject a question?
Yeah, sure, Mike.
Just, as people are watching this here, I guess the question that I have for the audience is how many people are still using quote unquote package bids or, conducting that annual sourcing event? If we had the ability to survey, I'd really be kind of curious because last week I was speaking at a traffic club function here in Chicago where I had a gentleman from a food company here, and he was addressing exactly what you were saying. And that is because there are so many changes occurring, much more so today than 5-6 years ago, they have scrapped their plans for annual bids and are in fact doing a rotating micro bid because it addresses changing market conditions. So it creates more work for their department, but it gets better pricing because it reflects what's going on. Could you just briefly address that?
Yeah, so you're talking about two issues. One is package bids and everything, but then the annual bid. And so my 2 cents is that the annual bid will never go away, but it'll be complemented. It makes sense for certain lanes, but not for all lanes. And I think Kevin would agree with this. Doing an annual bid for a lane that had 2 loads last year is a waste of time. And I'll talk about that. It's a guilty thing that a lot of shippers do.
It's easy.
But I think it has a role. Kevin?
But it's easy if you only have two lanes.
Yeah, there you go. So I think RFPs make sense. I mean, to set up a plan, but you shouldn't set up a plan for something that is constantly changing. That's a waste of time. And I'll talk more about that. So my opinion is RFPs, they're dead, but long live the RFP. It's going to continue, but you will see more frequent adjustments happening. I agree with that. Because it used to be all the expertise, all the sophistication was in the strategic side, the bid, because I could do that in planning, and we'll talk more about that. People spend a lot of time on this. In fact, I can start to go to my next slide and I'll talk about each of these stages and what's going on with them. But it served a purpose, but the problem is that it's not a hammer to be used for everything's not a nail. And that's unfortunately what it was used as. So let me continue. Is that okay?
Sounds good.
Okay, so when you look at the RFP, there's 3 periods to it, 3 stages, what you do before, during, and after, right? And so the pre-bid, you're determining what to bid, and you're cleaning your data, you're trying to, you're removing the pandemic from 2020 and 2021 for your forecast to 23. You're determining who to invite, whether it's incumbents or new entrants, and that's what you do in the pre-bid. During the bid, you get the rates back, and you can either give very detailed information to carriers. I've seen exceptionally detailed things, voluminous documents, or very vague. Whatever you give, you'll probably get back in turn. But carriers will submit rates and capacities. And I think it's down to about 1 to 3 rounds of bidding. In the 90s, there were some like a dozen rounds, 15 rounds. That's gone. But that was when people were first experimenting. And then post-bid is where you're doing the optimization that I just talked about. You're determining which carriers, which lanes, and getting that assignment done. And the challenge is, just because you have faster optimization and better software, because it is great now, there's some great packages out there, it has not sped up the process. It's just like the vacuum cleaner did not reduce the amount of time people take to clean. Their level of cleanliness went higher. So for here, if I have a tool that can spit out 1,000 scenarios in a day, I'm going to spend that day with 1,000 scenarios. So the optimization has not reduced the time, it's increased the ability to dive in. So you have executives make dozens to hundreds of scenarios. And then again, that lane assignment is fed into the TMS and the routing guide. What are the problems? Well, the first thing, the effort to do this is still enormous. It's gotten better. Data is out there, but data is still ugly. Volume forecasts that you're making 15 months out, because if you want to run a bid, say in February, I'm collecting the data now and making my forecasts. I'm going to give it out to the carriers, and it has to be for the next 12 months. So I'm making my forecasts of my demand over a year out, which is kind of insane, to be honest. And then volumes can be gamed. This is what we were talking about earlier. It's easy to say, okay, every lane I had volume on, just throw it in the bid. We'll get a rate. I'll keep that in my back pocket. I have a contract. That makes me feel better because it's like Linus's blanket, right? So I have coverage there. So that's where the problems with a big bid is, that you have some challenges there. When you talk about the bid itself, few carriers can handle a lot of the data that comes in, and so many of these come in. The process is only the bigger carriers can really handle this effectively or efficiently. And also carriers will also overbid. They will throw a bigger net. This just makes sense. They throw a big net because you're not going to catch every fish, right? And so they tend to win less than a quarter of the bids that they submit. And of what they win, only about half actually materializes. That's the frustrating thing. So even if they win, they don't really get it. So there's a lot of overbidding going on.
You're basically saying, putting on my CPA hat, that the carriers, even though they, in overbidding, the expectation there is that they'll basically get 12.5% of the business that they're bidding on. If you take
You
one
just did some math right there, didn't you?
Yeah, well, that's it.
Very impressive, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. But I think this is something that people need to understand. Because when we had the crunch of 2021, Chris, people were like, where are my carriers? They have a contract with me. But these carriers also, maybe you could just briefly address, and I don't mean to hold you up here, but these carriers are also trying to figure out, how am I going to allocate equipment based on the fact that I might only get 12.5% of what I bid, or in a really tight environment, now the expectation is they expect me to be there for 40 to 50% or whatever. And that's the compounding issue that I think a lot of people were surprised by in 2021, 2018, when the market was exceptionally tight.
Yeah, it goes both ways. Both shippers and carriers want consistency, right? And so but doing some of these contracts, it's a false sense of security sometimes. But let me just finish this up with the post-bid problems. And like what I said, all the sophistication goes into that, setting up the plan, and people will use a scalpel to, this carrier gets 3.8 loads per week on this lane and 6.7 here, and everything's very intricate. You feed this into a wood chipper, essentially, that is the routing guide. And it pretty much says this lane, this origin, this destination, this carrier, this price, and it gets totally dissected that way. Also, the time from when bid was submitted to implementation can stretch to be 6 months sometimes. And so there's been a lot, especially over the last 18 months, a lot of reneging of rates by carriers, even as they're submitted, as they're released. So this happens a lot. So these are the problems. And just like I think Churchill said it, the democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other forms we've tried. Bidding, they kept using it. RFPs are used, and they've been used for a long time. And the reason why, it kind of works. It kind of works. If you look in the best of times, like now, we're hitting 90% acceptance rates to the routing guide, even in the depths of the pandemic, it was in the 70s. Some lanes were really bad, but on average 70s, 80s, that's still the largest percentage, still goes by contract. But so it's worked for all this time, and it's hard to change. You know, change management 101 is you want to have a burning platform. And RFPs didn't have a burning platforms for a long time, but then something happened in the fall of 2017. And to quote the philosopher, Mike Tyson, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And 2017 to 2018 was when all the shippers got punched in the mouth. What I'm showing here on the bottom is the timeline, and contract is in blue and spot is in orange. And you'll start noticing spot, as we all know on this call, is much more volatile. It'll go higher amplitude, and it also is a leading indicator of what contract rates will do, because contract rates are like a big bathtub, right? And so it takes a lot of hot water to make that bathtub get hot, and a lot of cold water to cool it down. So spot rates is like the spigot coming in. And so you see the spot rates just jumping up, doubling in price in a very short period of time. And this is when all shippers are saying, hey, we're going to be shipper of choice. Let's be carrier friendly. Everyone's going to, make this crisis, don't let it go to waste. We're going to fix things. We'll be the best shipper ever. And then this happened in 2019, right? We saw that we're an inverted market where the spot rate was below contract, and all the shippers said, oh, wait, never mind. RFPs work just fine. We're good. Let's just drive those prices down. And this is when all the CEOs were saying, hey, why don't we go to the spot market? When the previous thing they were saying, hey, we have contracts. Why aren't they honoring them? And then, of course, we know what happened in the pandemic. Oops, there we go. And suddenly the rate, it made 2018 look like a joke, and it went up. And then this is when, hey, we're carrier friendly again. We want to be shipper of choice. And so we saw this going, and the big takeaway from this, I could go back 10 more years, is their cycles, right? And so now we just hit this. We've been in an inverted market for truckload since April 2022. We're entering our 8th month. Usually these inversions don't last more than 7-8 months. So we'll see if that goes longer. The gap is growing. It's shrunk a little bit in the last month between contract and spot. So we expect it maybe to come back, and we can have a discussion about that, what we think is going to happen at the end of the call, because we all have our different opinions. But this kind of demonstrates a big point. One is that spot rates lead contract rates. You can see that they kind of are shifted up by 6 to 9 months. They're also more volatile. So they're the canary in the coal mine. But it also shows you that we are subject to market forces, cycles. No one is a price maker. Everyone takes it. It's like riding the waves. Everyone has to ride the waves. You can't dictate what the waves do. So the question is, how do you handle that? And so faced with this is different from most other commodities. So the 3 things that I boil down to that I hear from shippers and transportation executives are these 3 things. I wish my C-suite would understand that 1, there are no economies to scale to truckload transportation. This is where truckload and LTL differ, and we'll talk about that at the end. LTL has economies of scale. Like we saw, they're buses. They want more volume. Second point, just because you've secured a contract on a rate on a lane doesn't mean you get a truck at that rate all the time. And the third, rate variability will happen. You can't cheaply, and I'll explain that in a second, contract it away, because that's what we're really trying to do. We're trying to contract away uncertainty to say, oh, we know. I had one transportation executive said their CFO asked them to set what the rates would be for the next 3 years, and we'd like to keep it constant at that. And I said, I can tell you what a rate that you would work for 3 years, but you won't be happy with it. But that's kind of the gap in the level of understanding. So what I want to do here is hit each one of these 3 and then kind of wrap it up and say, okay, what should shippers do facing these differences, these levels of weirdness in truckload trucking? So first, economies of scale. This is data from DAT-IQ, and this is the Freight Market Intelligence Consortium, about 200 shippers. And this is data this year up until August, but I could pick any year going back, and you'll see the same thing. The bottom is annual spend, right? So the bigger shippers are to the right. And this is the average cost per mile without fuel, just pure line haul. And just to be clear, this is long haul over 250 miles, dry van. And so what you see here is every dot is a company. And if there were economies of scale, I would expect to see a line from the top left to the bottom right? Because as I get bigger, my average cost per unit per mile should go down. And in fact, it goes up a little bit. There are diseconomies to scale, because if you think about it, if I'm a bigger retailer, a bigger manufacturer, I'm going to more places, which means my scope my connections, my balance are going to get harder. If I'm a small shipper, yeah, I might have, my cost of capital might be higher, those kind of things, but I'm not going as many places. So I'm probably more balanced, right? And so you see here, there are no economies of scale from a shipper's perspective. Now, if I'm a carrier, there are economies of scale to be a large carrier versus a small one in insurance and tires and those kind of things. But this is from the shipper's perspective of buying, none. And this is a hard sell to a lot of CFOs and CPOs. Second, this is the weirdest thing. I've explained this to economics professors before, and they don't believe me. Truckload contracts are only binding-ish. They're not real contracts, right? They're binding in price committed. And remember, this is the outcome of the bid, but they're not binding in the volume that the shipper is going to provide. They said 5 a week in the bid, and the carrier, bid according to that. Nor is it binding in the capacity committed by the carrier. Just because the carrier says they'll do it doesn't mean they'll always do it. And the question is, why? Why do we accept these binding-ish contracts instead of something hard and firm? And what's interesting here, it's the only example I can think of, and I'd love to have someone, if they have another example, where adherence to the RFP outcome, the contract, is considered a level of service, right? We look at on-time pickup, on-time delivery, and look at carrier acceptance, right? We treat adherence to the contract as another performance metric, which is kind of weird, but that's the way it's done. And why is it done? Because we have to. I think it's really an optimal contract for truckload carriers and shippers, because there's such a high level of spatial and temporal variability. You don't know when loads are going to come in. You might have 20 loads. You say 10 a week, and if that's a really high volume lane, they might all show up on Friday one week. So you can't handle that as much. So I don't think either party, shipper or carrier, really wants to commit 100%. Whatever the shipper put in the RFP, they can't commit to that because that's based on manufacturing. Transportation is a derived demand. They're not making the demand. They're subject to what's being sold or manufactured. On the carrier side, they can't commit to everything because it's going to come at a different time and place than they normally expect. So I think this contract with wiggle room on both sides is optimal, not for every lane, but for the vast majority of contracted lanes. So the other idea to this is that just because it's, it's a contract, it's binding, but that using the standard procurement method can actually hurt that RFP. Let me explain that. The common myth is that the RFP creates the routing guide, and the routing guide is the budget, right? It tells me every lane, every load, here's my total spend that I expect. In reality, the routing guide is at best a lower bound, right? Because it ignores any kind of failure of the routing guide, new lanes, or going to spot. And so the problem is RFP is what in procurement is called a coverage policy. Each lane has a contracted rate to reduce the risk of exposure to the spot market. Again, it's Linus's blanket. I have a rate for every lane and I keep them in my back pocket just in case I need them. The ugly truth is they usually don't get honored anyway for those one-off and small lanes, but we'll talk more about that in a second. But it can also actually hurt. And let me explain this from some work that we've done up here at MIT. And what I have here is 2 charts. The top one is for every row in the top chart is a lane and how much volume comes in loads per year, like over 100, 53 to 100. So you figure more than weekly. 13 to 52 means monthly to weekly, down to one load per year. And then I have in the top chart, the percentage of lanes that appear in 1 year that also showed up the next year. So for example, in 2016, 89% of the loads that had 7 to 12 loads showed up in 2017. And if you look at this, you can see as I go down the line, as I have lower volume on the lane, the probability it shows up the next year goes way down. To the ones, it's less than half. Okay. And then on the bottom chart, what I'm showing is what percent of lanes correspond to that. So for example, in 2018, lanes with 2 to 6 annual loads, so one every other month at most, constituted 28% of all the lanes in the network. So it's a big chunk, a quarter of the lanes, and only half of them showed up the next year. So what this means is these lanes constantly move. So if I use last year's history that I'm going to bid out, I'm bidding out a bunch of lanes that won't materialize. And there are other one-off lanes that are going to materialize that weren't in my bid. So there's a lot of churn here that's, why am I putting contracts on some of these lower volume lanes?
So can I just,
second point?
This is just one thing, Chris, that I want everyone to understand. Think about this for a moment. If you're buying aluminum, if you're buying, plastics or cartons or whatever, think about the commodity that you're purchasing. Go to your supplier and say, well, last year I did this. This year I might do this. Give us your best price. You're going to have a completely different dialogue because your suppliers are going to be looking for some base load guarantee that X says I can count on this as I go in and do my production and manufacturing plan. And basically the takeaway, and this is what we were talking about on the trade show floor with people, what you're basically asking carriers to do is bid on a theoretical construct as opposed to this is what's going to actually happen. Is that a fairly accurate assessment?
Yes, I like to call them aspirational. We hope that this is the volume that's going to be, and the carriers hope that the volume will materialize, and they price accordingly. Yeah, but what we found is what's interesting is doing this has risks for the next year, and so this is based off a paper that Angie Accacello, PhD, can just graduate. She's doing a postdoc now. Did a great job analyzing this. So essentially, if you look at this, I have a 2x2 here. And you have that first stage versus second stage procurement. And so what I'm showing here was the lane awarded to a carrier in the strategic bid in the RFP, yes or no? And then did at least one load happen over the course of the year on that lane? That's the second stage. And you see this blue box means yes, it was in the bid, and yes, volume came. And only at least one load. We didn't look at what was promised, just one. And that's that blue square. But then, and the bottom orange is you didn't award it in the strategic bid, but it materialized, so volume went on it, right? And then in this top right, the ghost lane box, that's where you had it in the bid, you award it to a carrier, no volume showed up, right? So you understand the three boxes. And of course, if it wasn't awarded and it never showed up, that's irrelevant. It never showed up. So let me show you what this looks like. 60%, 70%, and this is data using C.H. Robinson's TMC data, the great partner of ours doing research up here at MIT. These are all ghost lanes. The vast majority of lanes and bids are ghost lanes. They're up here in this right box. Now, you look at this now, it's not all the volume. This is a percent of lanes because most of the lanes that get ghosted are the very small ones, onesie twosies. And so it doesn't represent a lot of historical volume, but it's eating up all the time because if you look at the amount of time it takes for me to do a bid, it's a function of the number of lanes I have, not the number of loads on a lane. It's the number of things I'm assigning. So this kind of clogs the work. But Angie found something even more depressing, that every 10% increase in ghost lanes awarded to a carrier leads to higher rates, 1 to 2%, that next year from the same carrier. So it's a reputational risk. So by ghosting by a shipper ghosting a lane, you feel it the next year. And this is implicit increases that we've seen over years. So it's pretty interesting to see what the ramification. It makes sense, right? If I ghost you enough, then I'm going to increase my rates because I don't know if stuff's going to happen. And so it's kind of an interesting impact. All right, let me go to the third one because we're running out of time. The last one was that truckload rate variability will always happen. We think CFOs and CPOs sometimes think I can contract uncertainty away. I get my contract and I'm done because everyone honors their contracts. And I like the quote by Philip Dick here, that reality is that which when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. Variability won't go away, right? You can't cheaply contract your way out of uncertainty. I can pay 2x market rate and then you can buy certainty, but you're paying a lot for it. Rate variability will occur and it can either be unplanned or planned. If you paper your rates, you're going to have unplanned spot. But maybe you could recognize those lanes that are more susceptible to that. And we know how to do that now. There are characteristics you can use to identify those lanes and don't even put a contract rate on them. To go straight to spot for them. Use it strategically. The whole point here is that shippers are price takers. No one makes the market. And spot, in my opinion, should not be a four-letter word because it has been for the last 20 years. Spot market means bad, means you paid too much, right? And so I think you need to use it strategically. So to point this out, this is looking at all the data that we have, again, at DAT. This my colleague, Dr. Inam Ayub, put this together. If I look at on the horizontal, the number of weeks that volume is shipped on a lane, up to 52, 53 for a leap year, right? And so here I'm focused on 26 weeks. So this means a load every other week or, half the weeks. If I look at that, the number, this red line is the number of lanes. That is about 85% of the lanes only happen, 26 or fewer weeks of the year. And if I look at the orange, the shipment volume, it's probably 20% of the volume and probably almost 30% of the spend. So what we're seeing here is the lower volume lanes tend to dominate the number of lanes, but don't dominate the volume or the spend. Pareto is on steroids here, right? Very few of the lanes generate most of the volume and spend, but you've got a massively long tail. And the question is, I've got two very different characteristics of lanes. Why am I using the same contracting mechanism for all of them? Because they behave differently. And just to point that out, same thing, horizontal access, number of weeks of the year where I have volume. This pink or red is the percent that goes to spot, blue is percent that goes to contract. Obviously, lower volume goes to spot because they're better suited for that. Higher volume tends to go dominantly. If it's more frequent, a higher cadence will go to contract. Okay, so no economies of scale to truckload transportation. Truckload contracts are binding-ish. You need to understand that. And rate variability will happen regardless of what you do. It will happen because it's a market. So what should a shipper do? Two big things. First is explain to your C-suite that contract rates and spot rates are two different things. And the way I like to do this is to compare it to weather versus climate. And so weather is what's happening now. The temperature, the humidity, precipitation, what today's happening. And climate is what that weather is over a long period of time. And the obvious parallels for truckload transportation is spot rates and contract rates. And so if I look at this chart, you can see the contract rates in blue they move slowly. It's that big bathtub. It doesn't change its temperature overnight. Spot is just the opposite, very, very volatile, higher amplitudes, higher and lower, and it leads, right? And so the point here is you plan for climate, you plan for your contract rates, but prepare for weather. Have your umbrella near you so you have access to the spot market for two times. One is when you need that capacity, right, during these tight markets, but also to take advantage of the spot market during the inverted markets, right? And so you can do that what we have now. So it works for you on both sides. So make sure you plan for that. And the second thing, and this kind of ties it all together, and this is my last slide, I believe, to segment and procure using a portfolio. And so if you look at the basic continuum of lanes, they can be at one extreme, then the green, consistent, reliable, and balanced, they fit a nice structure. At the other extreme, they're variable, irregular, and unbalanced. They have 3 loads across the year. They go to nowhere. They're really sparse. So if those are the extremes on the continuum, then you can think about 3 contractual forms in your portfolio, in your bucket: dedicated, contract, and spot. So for dedicated, this has been well established. Every 3PL or engineering firm can come up with a really good solution. It's an engineered solution. You look for frequency, you look for balance, you look for a minimum size of fleet. This is well established, and this is why it grew 40% in 2021. And there's opportunity for cross-company collaboration. People have been chasing this for years, for decades, and we'll see if that actually happens. But it happens a lot, and I think companies are really good at identifying those. At the other extreme, spot still is considered a bad word. It's a 4-letter word, literally. But it's mainly accessed via brokers and best suited for niche areas, surges, sparse lanes, not always planned for, but we're seeing more people embrace it. And I think that's an important thing, is to identify those lanes that are going to go spot anyway. Because a lot of those lanes that you put a paper rate on, they went to the spot market anyway. They just traveled through, took a tour through your routing guide. And so why not just identify them early? Shippers who've done this have removed 50 to 60% of all their lanes in the bid, but only reduced their volume being bid by like 20%. So you reduce the effort of the bid, you focus those long lane problems on a spot solution, and it makes both processes better. And then again, for contract, it's too often treated as a one-size-fits-all, binding and price, not capacity or volume. I think there's also opportunity for better contract types coming in too. As you move closer to the green, maybe you can have a little more rigid, maybe take or pay type contracts, other things. As it moves closer to the red, maybe looser contracts. And so I think there's a lot of room for experimentation here in the truckload market, and that shippers should always rebalance their portfolio. As the market changes, you're going to shift. We're going to see a shift away from dedicated. It's harder because you made multi-year contracts, right? It's harder to shift that way. It's easier to shift the other way back, but we'll see how that goes. And with that, I think that's all I wanted to cover. And so at this point, Kevin, I'd love to have a conversation with you, answer any questions, and you can tell me where I went wrong.
Yeah.
What? I don't think you went wrong anywhere. And you've covered all the mechanics of this. Let me just start by saying, this is the time of year when everybody's involved in their budget discussions with their C-suite. It's a scary time of year. It's a painful time of year. And this year is very different than, let's say, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, when you went into your C-suite to explain your budget, first of all, the assumption was that your budget was going to be flat. And then you had to work through the math of the fact that your volume has gone up, so you have to use a multiple to make sure that even though we have maybe better prices or lower prices or flat prices, that we can make it work across the increased volume. Today, when you go in to talk to your C-suite, you really need to be talking about three things: the economic impacts of the current conditions. So inflation is certainly one big piece of that. You have to be able to explain to them, and Chris, you said this in your presentation, no single company is large enough to shape a market price. So every company is going to go in there. We're all competing for the same equipment, the same drivers, and no company is big enough to really swing it. And the third thing is that you need to protect your relationships long term. So let me talk about a couple of things here. First, when you go in to talk to your CEO and your CFO, they already understand that the world is under increasing inflation, and it's been double digits the last year. It's been creeping up on us for the last few years. So when we talk about pricing with our carriers, they have to take into effect the capital costs of equipment, capital leases, capital infrastructure. All of that money costs more today. Fuel costs, I think currently we're at $5.31 a gallon for diesel. A year ago, we were at about $3.35 a gallon. So that's gone up. Wages have gone up over 10% in the last year just to keep enough drivers in the mix. All of those things go into the calculation. So it's unreasonable to think the prices are going to go down. And although I think probably this is just a guess on my part, we're probably looking at 2 to 5% reduction in truckload costs over the next year, probably especially in the second half of 2023. So we might have steady pricing through the middle of the year and then get a reduction. So we might get an aggregated total of maybe 2.5% reduction next year. LTL, I'm not so happy about. I think we're probably going to see somewhere between, I guess, 4 and 8% increases. Although I was having a conversation with Mike a little bit earlier today, and apparently a lot of the LTL carriers are starting to waive accessorial charges and that sort of thing. So that could have an impact long term. But the important thing is the C-suite has to understand that we're fighting a battle uphill here right now. The marginal cost to operate a truck today is $1.92 a mile. A year ago, it was $1.85 a mile. 2 years ago, it was down in the 170s. So that cost has gone up, and the truck companies have to reflect that cost. That brings us to the relationship piece of it. Sure, it's great to do an RFP. Sure, it's great to get a contract. Sure, it's great to chase the spot prices. But long term, we have to remember that this is also a relationship business. And if you tick off every carrier that you deal with today, next year is going to be twice as hard to get the pricing that you need. So as you're explaining the economics, as you're explaining the fact that inflation is affecting all of your efforts to get better pricing, as you're explaining the fact that you don't have enough volume, no matter how big you think your company is, to swing the dog with your tail. And it's very important to remember that those relationships are going to be long-term, and you have a reputation in the industry to protect. If you beat people up today, they're going to come back at you with a vengeance later on. So you have to be rational, you have to be reasonable, and we're going to have to fight through the next year. And hopefully by the end of 2023, we'll see a little bit of more stabilization. But let's face it, higher prices are here to stay for the time being, and we're going to have to budget accordingly. Mike?
So if I could jump in, Kevin, because we got a bunch of questions and we're trying to answer them. And I know Chris is typing some of them out about timing of bids and all this kind of stuff. But help me walk through the dialogue that you're going to have or have had to have with your C-suite people talking about what Chris mentioned was derived demand. Understanding that, if you chase, the spot market right now, what precipitated this webcast, in fact, Chris, was you've had an inversion in the spot market that you had on your chart there. And so, you know, people are seeing, well, spot rates are going down. How come my contract rates aren't going down? And that is in a transactional, get the least cost on each and every move. But there's a downside to that, that it will impact service. So Kevin, you know, how do you get that message across? If we chase the spot market, it may impact our service levels. And if we want to basically have a stable relationship with our carrier base for your primary lanes, Chris, which I think you did a great job of explaining, you know, you have the Pareto effect, as you mentioned, not for the ones that I'm moving a load every 6 months. I'm talking loads that I'm moving 3 to 4 times a week, perhaps, or whatever. How do you get that message across, Kevin?
Okay, well, first of all, my recommendation would be, unless you have a great relationship with your CEO and your CEO hates your CFO, start with the CFO. Make the CFO your friend, because he's going to understand the effects of inflation here. He's going to understand that these prices are floating and you're chasing prices all the time. After you've established some kind of a rapport with the CFO and you've reached an agreement, that's the time to take it to the CEO, because there's much more power in having the CFO on your side as a supporting entity when you go to the CEO to tell them how this is working. I recommend against going to the entire C-suite and trying to explain this, because it's going to end up being two against one, 3 against 1, 4 against 1. And the prevailing sentiment is going to be, you have to find a way to get lower prices. And the reality is right now, we're looking at higher prices. We're mitigating costs right now. We're not lowering costs right now. So my opinion, start with the CFO, make him your friend, make him understand, him or her understand what these figures are telling us, and then take it upline.
Never piss off your CFO. That's the lesson I'm taking away, Kevin.
That's number one.
Okay, but what about the individual here that really, let's be candid, she or he really hasn't had an awareness of, you know, the CFO, and give you a hypothetical, Kevin. You're sitting there as a director reporting to a vice president. How do you coordinate with the VP so you're not going over her head, you know, and getting that information into the hand of the CFO?
Well, again, this is about relationships, it's internal relationships and external relationships. So if you have another layer in between you and the CFO to deal with, that's the person to get on your side first. Take your data, take your information, lay it out, explain that prices are going up. And by the way, all prices aren't going up. Ocean freight is down considerably. Ocean freight is down 66% compared to a year ago. We're paying actually less for a container today than we were 2 years ago to go from China to the West Coast. So all prices aren't going up. Today we're talking about truckload and LTL prices. You have to get it down on paper and make sure you've got support on this. You can't do it by yourself because you'll get beat up left and right. If you have an intermediary between you and the CFO, get that person on board first. Explain where the pricing is falling out. Explain where the opportunities are. Explain that the expectation has got to be set reasonably for what the cost is going to be next year. And if you think it's going to be 2 to 5%, you have to say 2 to 5%. You can't bet under budget and then try to dig your way out of the hole next year. You'll just end up getting fired.
Chris, any thoughts as we kind of close this out? We've got about another 2 minutes. You know, one of the things, Chris, that I think came away, and Kevin, you know, feel free to chime in, or Mark, you know, you said you can't budget, you can't get rid of variability. Variability is a reality. So the question that I would ask is, does it make sense for the people on this call, the hundreds of people that are on this call, to periodically, whether it's quarterly or whatever, publish a market update where the transportation market is going? You know, one of the things that has happened, because ocean rates have gone from 15 to 20,000 down to 2 or 3,000, and then they pick up in the Wall Street Journal, Paul Page at the Journal does a great job with this logistics thing, the inversion of spot rates. The immediate question is, why aren't my freight costs coming down a lot more? Any thoughts as we wrap this up, Chris, about how we position this and say, here's where we're at today, here's where we could be in the future, this is how it will impact our business?
You asked about an hour's worth of questions right there. Then I have a minute.
We'll do a follow-up webcast then, Mark.
But no, I
Let's
think
do it.
here's the thing, a couple points. One is you mentioned Paul Page, but there's so much information out there now. There are so many really good sources of finding where the market's going. A lot of opinions, and some I wouldn't recommend, but there's so much information out there. The companies are much more savvy. Second thing is, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the only person with a PhD was the CEO of Schneider, right? And before that, you didn't see PhDs in this market. Now, every broker, every carrier has a QA, a data scientist, a team of OR jocks doing this. So not only is there more information, there's more data, people are analyzing it. So I think we're much more sophisticated on the buyer, the seller, and the intermediary sides. And I think CSCMP has done great jobs here educating all three. I know when I got in this industry in the 90s, carriers hated shippers and everyone hated the railroad, right? And so it's changed dramatically. The people are finding there's a role, there's a place, and let's get the relationship right. And they're using data-driven analytics to help determine what the right fit is and where I should use which type of transportation where. And I think the relationships are still there. They're not like they were when I came in the 90s, where it was dinners, tickets to sporting events, and things like that. It's what can you do for me now? So I think the market's evolved dramatically, much more sophistication, even at the owner-operator level. They're at a level of technological sophistication that the large fleet drivers were 5-10 years ago, if not even less than that. So I'm very optimistic about this market.
And
Well,
Mike,
let me close out.
to answer your
Go ahead,
question
Kevin.
specifically though, whatever data you bring forward to your CFO or intermediary, you should keep a cheat sheet like that so that every month, every quarter, you can review those numbers and say, we talked about this number being at $1.92 a mile. It's now at $1.72 a mile. And that should affect us going forward. If you keep that information up to date, then you don't find yourself embarrassed leaving a meeting by saying, I'll have to find out for you later.
Yeah, let me just close out a couple things, Mark, before we just officially shut it down. On the LTL side, one of the things, what information is critical in order to get the best rates? There are three things that we strongly recommend. We've done billions of dollars worth of sourcing. First of all, ask your carriers for operating ratio data. We have found that for carriers with whom you have an effective partnership, they will share information from their operating ratio worksheets. We've got an LTL paper that we've done, we'd be happy to share with you, that will show you what's on an operating ratio worksheet. It really is critically important. Our group looks at that data and the carriers will share it with you if they feel like it's not going to be used at club. Second question came up, where do you get the kind of market update? First of all, Chris, I just wanted to say DAT each week has a weekly report, and my friend Dean Crook basically does a fabulous job of updating people. We put out a quarterly market update. Others, CH Robinson, DHL, we all put out quarterly updates that shares the information. And
Coyote is good too. Coyote has a good report. Coyote
Okay.
has a good report too.
Yeah, okay.
And they're
so
free. They're free.
Everything here is free. The other thing is, I can't strongly recommend enough. There are great associations, CSCMP, Knit League, that provide an ongoing stream. And to give you an idea how critical this is coming up, right now, the third largest rail union, one of the three top unions, has voted down the agreement. There's a possibility of a rail disruption on December 4th. After that, the port, now we're seeing some activity now that the midterms are over. We could see West Coast ports be disrupted. We've got a UPS contract that's up in the middle of next year. We've got diesel prices all over the place. That's why it's important to take into account what's going on in the market and share it upstream. Having said that, we've run a little bit over.
Thanks for the good news. Thanks for the bright
Yeah,
outlook
thanks.
there, Mike. Way to send us off on a ray of sunshine.
Well, it's Thanksgiving, so have a happy Thanksgiving. Mark, feel free to close us out.
Well, I just say that, this is what the world we're in is all about, and that is leveraging information to improve our business opportunities and our outlook. And one thing that's apparent is the culmination of data, the meaning behind the data, and the frequency of communication of what this data really means and how to deploy that in our own business. And today, strategic sourcing, whether it be in transportation or raw materials, they're all the same. We've all taken a deeper look at how to mitigate risk given the environment that we're in. And there are so many variables that approach us that it's almost impossible to understand any one element by itself. It takes a culmination. CSCMP creates an environment where leaders to leader conversations can occur. And everybody's a leader in their own right. You don't have to have a title. You're leading something each and every day if you're in supply chain. And for sure, we're all navigating the pressures of fear and pain. the fear of knowing that tomorrow can change. Heck, an hour from now, it can change. Just look what happened yesterday in the Port of Oakland and how quickly that snuck up on us. Today, that's gone. Tomorrow, it might be something else. You have to be a student of the business. And the best way to gather that is the community of supply chain professionals, academics and practitioners that come together to look at the most critical and important, if you will, business updates and research. And that's where you find CSCMPs right at the center. So Mike, I want to thank you for putting together this webinar, for sponsoring it and co-collaborating with CSCMP under the Transportation Center of Excellence. This is just a sign of more to come. We want to provide extreme value to all of our members and our guests. I'm Mark Baxon. I'm glad to be a part of this conversation.